This spacious palace with white stones surrounded by trees and green grass is the Lavadia Palace. It is located in southern Ukraine and was once the home of the last Russian Tsar, but is now the residence of a U.S. delegation. Today is February 4th, 1945. In this 116-room palace, 3 powerful countries are supposed to gather together and discuss an important issue. The flags of the 3 countries have been hoisted. The troops are all ready for a military reception. Everything is ready, and the ceremonial automobile enters the premises. The first guest is a 71-year-old man. He has a strange addiction to his Cuban cigars. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It doesn't take long for Joseph Stalin, the host of this major meeting, to arrive. Stalin is a 65-year-old short man with a thin mustache. His first official mission was to organize government and military files. He is now going to sit at this round table and decide about the fate of the world as the leader of the Soviet Union. But the third chair belongs to Franklin Roosevelt. The New York Times wrote about his first 100 days in office as president. He takes power like a dictator. Paralyzed from the waist down due to polio when he was young, Roosevelt could hardly stand on his own 2 feet without help. However, he has come to this meeting as the head of one of 3 powerful countries. The theme of the meeting is the future of the world after the Second World War. Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, with his trademark mustache, greatly disturbed the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union for his territorial expansion dreams after grabbing power. They had to stand up against him so that their powers in the world would not be debilitated. The alliance of the trio states against Germany achieved the predicted results in World War II. After these 3 superpowers got involved in the war, the German Nazis' wings were clipped and paved the way for Allied nations to enter this huge palace. They're supposed to talk about the defeat of Nazi Germany and share their achievements from the war. 8 days later, while the 3 major leaders are standing in front of the cameras, no one knows what lies behind the smiles of the 3 commanders. Their words are going to change the future of the world. And this story is not an ordinary story. It is a complex story about the future of the largest military organization in the world today, NATO. It was the 28th of July, 1914, when the First World War broke out. Amid the news of the destruction of cities in the war, some news has gone viral among the people. The world's first communist country was born. The country is called the Soviet Union. People in the world have not yet gotten used to the name of this large country when the International Communist Organization is formed with the aim of making the world communist. A great fear arises among the European powers. By now, Everyone has understood that communism intends to form a classless society whose economy is controlled by the government and its citizens are under the scrutiny of the government. They have no other goal than to serve the society, just opposite to the capitalist system that is the dominant mindset of Western countries these days. In order to achieve maximum profit, the capitalist system bases the society's administration on free elections and manages the economy, production, and agriculture by private individuals. So it is a serious opponent of communism. These two views will remain in opposition to each other until Germany becomes the dominant power in the world. For this man with his toothbrush mustache, the dream of territorial expansion is not something that would bring Soviet communists and Western capitalists under a united flag. Ideological differences between the two gradually fade away. But just when everything is in place to create a front against the Germans, the UK and France refuse to agree. They do not trust the communists who intend to bring the world under their banner. The Soviet leader is annoyed by this hesitation. Ever since he chose the Russian name Stalin for himself, he became known as Iron Man, an Iron Man who knows very well what decision to make for the communists in critical moments. August 1939, some news spreads in the world. The news shocks the West much more than the news of the destruction of cities in the First World War. The Soviet Union and Germany reach an agreement. The text of the agreement, which is signed on the non-aggression of both countries and the division of Eastern Europe between them, begins World War II. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Everything is going according to the agreement by the two countries, but on June 22, 1941, Hitler orders a massive attack against Soviet territories. An attack that is referred to as the largest and most extensive military attack. Stalin feels completely desperate. He has no choice but to fight the Germans. He now pivots to the West. Stalin desperately needs their help to succeed in the war. Germany's advance in the war scared Roosevelt and Churchill, so they get on board to negotiate with Stalin. However, they're still worried about the consequences of their move. Will Stalin remain loyal to them? No one knows. The only thing they are sure about is the danger of the German army's massive penetration in Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill make their decision. They extend a hand of friendship to Stalin. The private meetings where Roosevelt and Churchill call Stalin Uncle Joe for more intimacy. After news about the alliance spreads around the world, some believe that they have put aside their political differences. But no one knows that heads of these three countries themselves have no decision for this. They get together in their meetings and drink and dine and take photos in honor of one another. But in their minds, they dream and fantasize about defeating each other. The alliance takes its toll on Germany. Hitler is the loser of the war. The US, the UK, and the Soviet Union are the winners. Now they had to sit and once again discuss the spoils of war, of which European territory is the main one. The city of Potsdam will host the Allied States once again. The Allied States that have experienced changes in the past few months. President Roosevelt has passed away. People in the U.S. will replace Roosevelt with his first vice president, Harry Truman.
Scene 2144A.
The inexperienced Truman is sent to Potsdam Conference as the chief negotiator. The Americans now know Stalin better. After their new president meets him, they become emboldened and nickname the Soviet leader the Little Bud. While Stalin, with his thin mustache, is only a few centimeters shorter than Truman. It only takes a few days from the start of the conference that the British Prime Minister, Churchill, is informed that he has lost in the parliamentary elections and now he has to pack up and leave Potsdam. Clement Attlee replaces him. In the heat of the meeting, when the heads of state are sitting facing each other and talking about the agreements between them, Truman breaks some confidential news to Stalin. But the secret news does not seem to surprise Stalin very much. The US and the UK, that had secretly decided to build an atomic bomb during the World War, decided to use it against the Nazis in the war. But Germany had surrendered before the bomb was ready. Contrary to what the US thought, Stalin was aware of the secret information. When the Soviet Union was involved in the war with the Germans, Stalin was aware of the Westerners. He doesn't want to be deceived in the war any longer, so he launches a massive operation to spy on his allies. And now they're making atomic bombs was not something that would escape the eyes of the Soviet spies. Stalin is very scared. With his knowledge about the Americans, he knows that if they have an atomic bomb, they will soon blackmail him over the spoils of the war. So, after the conference, Stalin decides to issue a license for an intensive program to build an atomic bomb. This old communist man has understood the situation very well. Despite the fact there are two new leaders, the trump card is in his hands, but only if he adopts the right policy. Stalin, the powerful and cold-blooded dictator, these days knows very well what goals he should pursue in the post-war period. According to the agreement, Europe is divided into two eastern and western parts, and the management of each part is entrusted to one of the powerful countries. When the East goes to the Soviet government and the US government brings the West under its control.
Let's not forget that we are fighting for peace and for the welfare of mankind.
This is where differences and excessive demands begin, as the West intends to establish democracy and free elections in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union orders the formation of communist governments in the region. Now Truman also falls into the power game and intends to move the balance of power beyond the Western Hemisphere. He knows very well that Stalin intends to raise the flag of communism in the world. According to Truman and Stalin, there's only one way to solve the differences of opinion in politics: war. But in the meantime, neither the Soviets nor the Americans have the ability to enter into another war. So a new chapter of world wars begins. The people come to know this as the Cold War, a war without a single bullet. Eastern and Western Europe have come under the control of two big majors, which greatly disturbs Stalin. Although the Soviet government managed to expand its borders a few hundred kilometers to the west and establish its dependent regimes throughout Eastern Europe, not all countries under its influence have yet become communist. The US and UK have repeatedly asked the Soviet Union to hold free elections in the Baltic states, Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe, but the communist dictator refrained from taking any practical step. Stalin makes his decision. The devastating Soviet losses in the war have made Stalin unable to flex its muscles. He needs to take prudent steps. He makes his decision. The Westerners' wish for elections is fulfilled, but the Eastern European countries will have to hold an election whose leaders are acceptable to the Soviet government. But Stalin is facing a big problem to implement this policy. Some European countries, like Poland, do not like communism. They have never forgotten the memory of Hitler's attack and Stalin's initial support for them in 1939. In Poland, Stalin has no choice but to impose his puppet government on them, otherwise Poland will slip out of his control. But it not only made Poland hate communism even more, but also made Stalin's allies, namely the US and UK, doubtful. Their hesitation did not go away even until 2 weeks before Roosevelt's death. Roosevelt believes that Stalin will not fulfill any of the promises he made for peace between European countries. At that time, if Roosevelt knew he would not live long enough to participate in the Potsdam Conference, he would have given his first Vice President, Truman, some advice about Stalin. In 1946, the Soviet intelligence service, which was assigned by Stalin to spy, gained access to a long and secret telegram. The telegram was from a young officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, George F. Kennan. Stalin checks the telegram in detail. It seems to be an important telegram, but the more he scrutinizes it, the less he is successful in seeing a solution from the U.S. In the letter, Kennan reports to his authorities. Soviet leaders are forced to treat the outside world as a hostile world because this is the only excuse for a dictatorship without which they did not know how to rule. There will be no change in the Soviet Union strategy until it has suffered a long enough streak of defeats to convince the future leader of the Kremlin that Soviet behavior is not in their interests. There is no need for war to achieve this result. Stalin is completely confused. How is the US going to face the Soviet Union this time? In June 1947, Truman designated the sullen military man George Marshall as his Secretary of State.
We should therefore carefully avoid approaching international problems on an emotional basis and certainly counsel of fear. We need to exercise calm judgment in determining the wise course for this country to pursue, and then pursue it with determination and firmness.
Marshall, one of the commanders of World War II, who received the title of the designer of victory from Churchill due to his management, proposed a solution for this problem. The United States should commit to rebuilding post-war Europe with economic aid. Stalin knows better than anyone what reconstruction means. Little by little, with the implementation of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe, the ideological frameworks of communism start shaking. The financial guarantees provided by the U.S. aid enabled Western European governments to begin building their modern welfare states. The working class in European countries who are enjoying a better lifestyle completely forget communism. September 1947, Stalin finally steps in.
Leaders of the party and government, representatives of the various Soviet republics, and of the Communist and Workers' Party.
The Cominform, or the pre-war International Communist Organization, is what Stalin has been thinking about for a while. Stalin believed when the goal of the Cominform became loyalty to the main principles in the international communist movement, the space for freedom of opinion among Europeans would become narrower. Now it is Truman's turn to act against Stalin. He checks all the options. The problem has only one solution. In 1948, just as the Italian people were busy casting their votes in elections, the CIA planned a secret operation. The operation had a clear effect on the election. Communism loses the election. Stalin is still stunned by the election results, which makes the situation more complicated for him. It was really painful for the Soviet leader. Czechoslovakia, the only democratic government in Eastern Europe, attempted a coup that year. Developments and the suspicious death of the Czechoslovak foreign minister Jan Masaryk sends a clear message to the communist opposition. Other Europeans all know that any opposition to Stalin's sphere of influence will eventually result in a Masaryk-style repression. Eastern Europeans are all horrified by Stalin's policies, all but one country, Yugoslavia. Josip Broz Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, came to power on his own and does not need Stalin to stay in power. He is a danger to the Soviet government these days. Tito seems to have gotten bored with Stalin's policies due to Cominform's insistence. He has made a serious decision to cut off his country's relations with Moscow. Tito finally does it a year later. Although Stalin's indifference on this issue is a bit mysterious, is there anyone in the Soviet Union who does not know that the incident can send a shockwave through the communist pillars? Stalin has become confused. Moscow has not yet recovered from Tito's move when it was reported that the Soviet leader had taken military action. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was sieged.
Как и вся славная Красная Армия, начала свой славный боевой путь от Сталинграда, где закончила прославутую банду, что нашей славной армии руководит наш великий советский народ, великая наша партия, великий мудрый товарищ Сталин. Ура!
In a war that took several years, everyone already understood that if neutral Germany gradually tilts toward the Soviets, the Cold War in Europe will be in favor of the communists. But if the opposite happens, and Germany moves towards the US, things will get much worse for the Soviet Union. A part of Germany fell into the hands of the Americans that was considered the richest and most developed part of Europe. If the US wants, it can easily turn the region into a powder keg to attack the Soviet Union. Therefore, Stalin should move more cautiously against Germany. Stalin, who thinks the solution is to lay a siege on Berlin, makes the US Army spring into action. They deliver food and other necessities to the besieged city by building an air bridge. Berlin appreciates the move. The Westerners are now a friendly face in the eyes of the German people, as opposed to Stalin, who now has a wild and powerless image in front of the world. The US government gradually takes over the communists. Meanwhile, the Soviet government has no idea that Truman was up in arms to shatter their ideology. In November 1947, a plan was prepared by the Joint Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army called Broiler. The main goal of the plan was to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to wage a war using massive atomic bombardment. The plan considers 34 atomic bombs against 24 Soviet cities at a time the medical reports from the experiments conducted on the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan's atomic bombing are still on Truman's desk. Truman knows very well what consequences await the Soviet Union. However, he prefers to continue sipping his French coffee at his desk and run up and down the report statistics. 2 years later, when over 200 atomic bombs and 20 bombers were prepared for the operation, Truman met with some military experts. They believe that if the U.S. fails to prevent atomic bombing, the bombs may not be effective enough to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to fight. At this time, Truman receives a recommendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which makes him think about finding a solution. The Joint Chief of Staff believes the U.S. forces cannot defend Western Europe against the communists even if they use the atomic bomb. Truman must come up with a proper solution. Broiler's plan fails to achieve the objective. Two years later, it was reported that the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. American scientists start thinking harder. The issue is slowly turning into an arms race. A little later, a group of American nuclear scientists solve Truman's problem in the major war. They make a thermonuclear bomb or super bomb. Estimates say the new technology can cause an explosion that no one dares tell Truman about the consequences. The only thing everyone is thinking about now is only one thing: not falling behind the Soviet nuclear industry. In the fall of 1948, Truman begins a new chapter of his negotiations with Western European countries. Western Europe is now ready to cooperate with the White House after the implementation of the Marshall Plan in their countries and receiving economic aid from the U.S. The main objective of discussion in Truman's negotiations with Western European countries is a formal treaty of alliance against communist Soviets. Truman finally forms his international union. NATO is the title the European countries now must line up for membership in. In April 1949, the NATO treaty was signed in Washington by 10 European countries, as well as the US and Canada. contents of the treaty, which were published, put Stalin in a bind. 1. If one NATO member country is attacked, all members will provide it with military support. 2. NATO members are committed to cooperating in various military fields, including intelligence exchange, military training, and joint exercises. And 3. NATO members should use similar equipment and weapons to facilitate their military cooperation. It is 1955. It's been 2 years since Stalin died. Some news spreads in the world. The news terrifies the Soviet Union. West Germany has joined NATO.
La séance est ouverte, monsieur. Messieurs, l'événement que nous sommes appelés à marquer ici aujourd'hui a une importance exceptionnelle. La République fédérale d'Allemagne vient prendre solennellement, comme le 15e pays membre, égal aux autres, sa place au sein du Conseil atlantique.
Now we welcome to our company the Federal Republic of Germany, represented here by its great statesman, Dr. Adenauer.
Sera la première séance plénière de notre Conseil.
The emergence of a militaristic Germany determined to reunify could be a wake-up call for the Soviet Union that has already been invaded by Germany. During the last days of Stalin's rule, when the political and economic situation in Eastern Europe had deteriorated, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, must seriously pursue reconstruction and improvement of the situation in Eastern Europe. During these years, East Germany is not doing well. Since 1951, suppression of private businesses by the government, forced membership in collective farms, dissatisfaction with the communist system, and the desire to live in the economic prosperity of the West have driven some East German residents from this region to West Germany. As his first moves, the new Soviet leader resumes ties with Tito. Khrushchev is not happy with Stalin's measures. Yugoslavia resigns the Fraternity Pact with the Soviet Union. But the troubled situation in East Germany and West Germany's accession to NATO will still be big problems for Khrushchev. Khrushchev must find a solution. So he decides to drag 7 Eastern European countries to the Warsaw Pact. Dubbed a military alliance, the treaty commits communist countries of Eastern Europe to help each other in the event of an armed attack by the West. Now Europe is divided into 2 armed groups, the West under NATO and the East under Warsaw. Following these agreements, Soviet tanks were deployed to East Germany in 1953, Hungary in 1956, and Czechoslovakia in 1968 to crack down on anti-communist movements. Although the evidence suggests that NATO is an alliance of sovereign states, the Warsaw Pact appears to be an imperialist enterprise of puppet regimes under the complete domination of Moscow. Now, Western narratives and propaganda have touched on this fundamental difference. However, while NATO insists on introducing itself as a defense association, everyone gradually gets suspicious due to its actions. In 1960, the U.S. proposes a plan called Multilateral Force. The plan seeks to create a navy consisting of ballistic missile submarines and warships with international crews from NATO member states. Military equipment, all of which are armed with ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. In 1985, something happens in the Soviet Union which shakes the very foundations of communism. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's economic reforms gradually dragged the Soviet Union into serious economic problems. The severe shortage of food resources turns supporters of communism into vocal dissidents. Gorbachev's slogans take Western shape. Although he commemorates communist leaders, when he leads the Soviet Union towards democracy and the free world, he is praised by the Western media. He gets overwhelmed by the Western encouragements. The so-called reforms by Gorbachev not only do not solve the Soviets' problems, but also lead to the collapse and fragmentation of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, with all of its violations and evils, at least its geographical scope, could be a defense barrier against the expansionism of Westerners.
That this move was extra-constitutional, outside of the constitutional provisions for governmental change. Clearly, it's a disturbing development. There's no question about that. And it could have serious consequences for the Soviet society and in Soviet relations with other countries, including the United States.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the U.S. removes its biggest enemy and the Cold War ends. The U.S. government, which promised Gorbachev that NATO will not advance even an inch towards Russia, in no time it forgets its promise. The promise is going to get the allies of communism involved. The story now reaches Yugoslavia. After the end of World War II, the two major and powerful countries that had celebrated their victory in the war had to face off. The Soviet Union and the US, the two powerful superpowers that could never settle their differences over the management of the world, now had to get involved in another war, a war that history called the Cold War. In this war, the two countries were pitted against each other both politically and militarily, but without firing a single bullet at one another. And now the rest of the story. It is August 1987. The responsibility of leading the Soviet communists has fallen on this man's shoulders for 2 years. The man is mostly known by this big brown spot on his head, Mikhail Gorbachev. Some people say the spot was left after an angel's kiss, and others believe it is a stork bite. But whatever it is, it distinguishes Gorbachev from all his previous leaders. It all started this summer when Gorbachev arrived at this bungalow in Crimea for his summer vacation. Gorbachev was supposed to stay in this bungalow and play dominoes with his close friends and hear old jokes, but he stays and starts reading a book he has never seen before. A book titled Young Marx, a book with economic and philosophical manuscripts whose ideological basis is aligned with the US and based on opposition to Soviet communism. The book does the job. Gorbachev extends his vacation for another week. He has some ideas. His correspondence with the academicians of the Moscow Study Institutes starts from Crimea. The subject of the correspondence is a contract with US publishers to write a book about the new economic reforms in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev plans to change the entire system of his country from economy to mentality. But he doesn't trust anyone for this. He does the research and writing on his own. The Soviet leader enjoys this. He dictates the text of the draft to his friends several times until he gets what he has in mind. The title of Gorbachev's book is Perestroika, New Thinking for Our Country and World. And this story is not an ordinary story. It is a complex story about the future of the largest military organization in the world today, NATO. During the hot summer in the summer house, Gorbachev decides to improve his relations with the West. He believes that this is the only way to improve the dire economic situation that the Soviet Union is involved in these days. Although after the introduction of these reforms, the communists call Gorbachev a badger, none of them know that the dream of the 54-year-old Soviet leader is going to shake a region, a tremor as severe as full-scale war. This short, domed building, which is located by the East River, hosts 154 members today. One of these members is Gorbachev, the fashionable leader of the Soviet Union. Today, he's supposed to take the podium and deliver an important speech. Gorbachev has put on a neat suit and is preparing his speech papers. He knows very well that his words today have contradictions with previous Soviet leaders. Gorbachev is going to state the Soviet Union's new stance at the United Nations, the new stance that will surely surprise all countries. Finally, Gorbachev takes a stand and reads out his speech from the paper.
The Soviet Union has taken a decision to reduce its armed forces. Within the next 2 years, their numerical strength will be reduced by 500,000 men. The numbers of conventional armaments will also be substantially reduced.
The end of the Cold War, with the withdrawal of 500,000 Soviet soldiers from Eastern Europe, is what Gorbachev announces in his speech. He pledges to the UN member states that he will free areas under Soviet influence so that they can determine their own fate. In this meeting, Gorbachev practically pulls the Soviet Union out of the arms race.
For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction. Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, WWIII no provyai. Trust but verify.
Назначение этого...
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
You repeat that at every meeting.
I like it.
The speech is quite abrupt for this man whom Gorbachev called a real dinosaur. George Bush Sr., who has just taken office as the 41st President of the United States. Bush's advisors inform him that Gorbachev's words may be a big political lie in order to deal a decisive blow to Western democracy. Bush Sr. does not take the advice lightly. A year later, he settles everything in a meeting with Gorbachev. It is December 1989. The Soviet Union and the US inform the media that their first joint meeting is underway on a Soviet passenger ship in a port in Malta. Bush and Gorbachev are going to reach new accords in the meeting to put the minds of Americans at ease. The agreement between the two sides in Malta includes both arms control and making a decision about Germany, which was divided between the two superpowers after the Second World War. The reunification of Germany and demolition of the Great Berlin Wall, which separates the East from the West, has been discussed by both sides in the Cold War for years. The US was one of the supporters of the German alliance, and the Soviet Union was considered one of its unrelenting opponents. Germany can only be united if its ruling system is communist, and this is exactly the condition that America will not accept under any circumstance. But this time, it is not like previous times. Gorbachev is different from other Soviet leaders. Contrary to America's prediction, the negotiations are going well. Bush never thought that when the issue of unification of Germany without communism was raised, Gorbachev would remain silent. And the silence for Bush means a recognition of the U.S. as a great power in Europe. After the meeting, both sides officially declared the Cold War is over. Bush is relieved. He thinks that the ultimate winner of the Cold War is none other than the U.S. government, but his advisors do not share this belief. They believe that the bell of the end of the Cold War will ring only when the official collapse of the Soviet Union is announced. And now Bush is counting down for that time. A few days after Gorbachev's return to his country, it was reported that the government's economic problems had taken their toll. The Communist Party of Lithuania has declared independence and pulled itself out from under the heavy shadow of the Soviet Union. Gradually, other communists in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence start to believe that in order to grab power, they need to jump on the bandwagon of forming a national revolution. Gorbachev is helpless. He's already promised the Soviet people that he will hold free elections in 1990. Unlike other Soviet leaders, he deeply wants to implement democracy in the country under his tenure. The passion for revolution scares communist leaders. They want Gorbachev to postpone the elections. But Gorbachev disagrees. In his opinion, this retreat from his previous positions can overshadow his leadership on the people. A few months later, elections will be held in all countries under Soviet influence. Free elections with people's participation. Although things are going the way that Gorbachev wanted, the results are not what he expected. In all the member states of the Soviet Union, non-communist parties are at the helm of their country's administration. Now they have to do what the people want. Declaration of National Independence. The situation in Yugoslavia is getting worse. Yugoslavia in the southwest of Europe, which was formed by the union of three countries, namely Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, since the First World War, and was under the influence of the Soviet Union after World War II. The gathering of these three countries, with all of their cultural, religious, and ethnic differences, was not something that anyone could fail to notice. However, Yugoslavia was ruled by its communist leader, Marshal Tito, and all ethnicities lived together under a common ideal called communism. Tito's first priority in leading multi-ethnic Yugoslavia was to eliminate all internal opposition. Tito transformed Yugoslavia into a federal republic with 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Gorbachev's reform agenda was implemented in the Soviet Union 10 years after Tito's death. The lack of communist leadership in Yugoslavia had gradually led to the ethnic divisions that no longer had any common ground. Although Tito had bequeathed after his death that the leader of Yugoslavia should be elected in an election by the members of an elected body, the communists did not approve of the situation. Differences regarding the structure of the government gradually emerged. Serbs favored a strong federal government, and other leaders wanted the transfer of power to the republics. It was in this situation that Gorbachev was implementing his reform agenda. Gorbachev never considered this. Although he always wanted to transfer power to the republics under his influence, he had no intention of breaking up the Soviet Union. The alliance by the communists has now reached an economic deadlock.
Народом нашей страны, строго следовать Конституции, гарантировать.
In March 1990, the Congress nominated Mikhail Gorbachev as president of the Soviet Union. Now, Gorbachev should face the problems of the Soviet Union as a president instead of a leader. The Soviet Union, which is now facing a serious problem, and that is the passion of the people for independence of their countries. But Gorbachev has come up with a new idea to solve that problem: a closer bond between the Soviet Union and Europe. He views Europe as the future of the Soviet Union. In February 1990, Gorbachev finally makes a decision. If East and West Germany are united, the Soviet Union will survive. People in East Germany, already fed up with the economic policies of the communist governments, are looking for a way to escape to West Germany. West Germany has a strong economy. In May 1990, 2+4 talks will be held. East and West Germany and the victorious countries of World War II are participating in the negotiations, and they're supposed to discuss the unification of Germany. The Western powers want to get the Soviet leaders' consent to join NATO in any possible way. They don't seem to have a daunting task. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and the US President George Bush are determined to convince Gorbachev to do this.
The agreement on destruction and non-production of chemical weapons. Соглашение по уничтожению и непроизводству химического оружия.
Gorbachev's worried looks can be noticed behind his glasses. He is afraid of a united Germany. In his opinion, a united Germany is more dangerous for the Soviet Union than a NATO member Germany. During the negotiations, the US administration, which promises Gorbachev that NATO will not expand even an inch to the east, assures the Soviet leader regarding Germany's accession to NATO. Gorbachev did not have the faintest idea that the commitment will later be violated when the Bill Clinton administration takes office. But after the negotiation, which marked the beginning of the unification of Germany and the withdrawal of Soviet forces from its territory, it did not reduce tensions in the Soviet Union. Free elections are also held in Bosnia and Herzegovina in November 1990, an election where votes are largely cast according to the ethnicity of the people. Power is divided. The presidency of the Presidential Council goes to a Bosnian Muslim, the parliamentary presidency to a Serb, and the premiership to a Croat. And national separatist parties rose to power in Croatia and Slovenia. In December 1990, some news spreads about the Serbian elections. It was about this Serbian and presidency, Slobodan Milosevic. He later became known as the Butcher of the Balkans. Milosevic is trying to unite all Serb-inhabited areas of neighboring republics of Serbia. For this, he has no choice but to take military action. Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo become the target of the newly elected president of Serbia. People in the region, and of course Gorbachev, smell a bloody war. It is not known what the war is going to do to the Soviet Union. Russia is one of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union. This man becomes the president following 3 elections in the country. He is severely addicted to alcohol. Boris Yeltsin. In his first move after coming to power, Yeltsin plans for declaration of Russian sovereignty. He tries to put the laws of the Russian Republic ahead of the laws of the Soviet Union. He believes this is not enough for Russia's independence, so he decides to take the podium and officially resigns from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's only concern now is that other republics might want to follow in Russia's footsteps. The concern is legitimate. On June 25, 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declare their independence. The Declaration of Independence leads to a 10-day war. The situation is not under Gorbachev's control yet when one morning on a hot summer day, the Soviet people wake up to a terrible storm that changes their fate completely. On August 4th, 1991, it was announced that Gorbachev had gone to Crimea for summer vacation, just like previous years. So space opens up for the communist radicals who are against Gorbachev's policies. Some plots have been hatched to stage a coup against the communist general secretary. It took place just 2 weeks after Gorbachev went to Crimea. On August 20th, tanks marched towards Moscow. Rumor has it Gorbachev has gone on sick leave and now the Government Emergency Committee is in charge. The committee is chaired by the first Vice President of the Soviet Union, Gennady Yanayev, who is considered about the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Вы знаете из сообщений средств массовой информации в связи с невозможностью по состоянию здоровья исполнения Михаилом Сергеевичем Горбачевым обязанностей президента СССР.
Martial law is put in place. People no longer have any doubts that a coup has taken place. The coup was staged the day before when Gorbachev was locked up in his summer home.
Я заявляю, что все, что касается состояния моего здоровья, это обман. Таким образом, на обмане совершен антиконституционный переворот.
In the very bungalow where the Soviet leader once came up with his reform plan. Moscow is falling apart. People take to the streets and gather in front of the Russian parliament. Yeltsin and his advisors are entrenched in the parliament. Everything is going according to plan until the afternoon of the day of the coup, when a simple coincidence turns the tide. The commander of one of the tank battalions, who was sent to disperse the crowd in front of the Russian parliament, suddenly declares his loyalty to the Russian Republic. Yeltsin comes out of the trench, walks up to one of the tanks, and takes a swipe at the coup. The military rule is collapsing. The coup plotters lose their grip. Now Yeltsin is in command. Yeltsin establishes the Russian armed forces under his command. On the third day, the coup plotters surrender.
Today, we have adopted a resolution to declare the three-colored flag our official Russian flag.
Gorbachev returns to Moscow on a plane sent by Russian leaders. By order of Yeltsin, all the activities of the Soviet Communist Party in Russia are stopped. Party offices are closed and Central Committee building in Moscow is sealed. Now Gorbachev must listen to Yeltsin's order and read from a transcript in the parliament that he wrote for him. This transcript is a document of the betrayal of Gorbachev's communist allies, and here the power equation actually changes in the Soviet Union.
Read it out for everyone. Mikhail Sergeyevich, read the document. Read it. Comrades, let's take a break and sign a decree suspending the activities of the Russian Communist Party.
Фактически есть договор. Да.
и политический, и экономический какой-то счет, где упраздняются все государственные структуры СССР.
Yeltsin, who now has become stronger, gets to work. He works with leaders of other republics to create a new union of independent states. He actually intends to completely bypass the Soviet Union. After the coup, Gorbachev no longer has any power. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, who resigns, does not object to the complete confiscation of the party's property and assets in Russia. There's no trace of communism left. Now the desire for independence has erupted in other countries of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is practically the president without a country. He officially resigns from his post.
Дорогие соотечественники, сограждане, в силу сложившейся ситуации с образованием Содружества независимых государств я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
Although everyone knows that he can still resort to force with his presidential power to preserve the alliance, Gorbachev never does such a thing. He deeply believes that a union created by force will not be a substitute for the Soviet Union. Gorbachev has no intention of presiding over a dictatorship. He is doing all he can to prevent the Soviet Union from becoming another Yugoslavia whose ethnic civil wars Gorbachev never forgot all those years. In September 1991, the Yugoslav Serbs started raising the issue of secession and creating 6 autonomous regions. Croats are starting to work in Bosnia. The whispers of the collapse of Yugoslavia can be heard everywhere. Civil war in Yugoslavia is getting intense. As a first step, Serbs attack Croatia. On September 25th that year, the United Nations Security Council ratifies Resolution 713. In this resolution, the members impose an arms embargo on all Yugoslav territories to prevent a civil war. But the sanctions not only do not put an end to the civil war, but also make things more complicated. The arsenals and barracks of the former Yugoslavia are all under Serbian control. The Croatian army can run the affairs by smuggling weapons through the sea. The arms embargo only makes things harder for the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They now have to resist a Serbian attack with no weapons. This is Bosnia and Herzegovina, a small and beautiful country with pristine areas and a population of about 4 million people in the heart of the Balkan region and southern Europe. Bosnia is one of the countries where Islam, Orthodox Christianity, and Catholicism coexist. During these years, when Yugoslavia falls apart and its small and big republics declare independence, the situation for the people of the region becomes difficult. They come at a crossroads. Either they should be parts of the greater Serbia or resist for independence and prevent the destruction of their identity. An independence referendum will be held on March 1st, 1992. The Bosnians vote yes for independence. And this is not something that many people like. Bosnia, 44% of whose population is comprised of Muslims, can pose a great threat for the US and Europe. So the Western powers allow the leaders of Serbia and Croatia to secretly plan the partition of Bosnia among themselves. On April 6 of the same year, the army of former Yugoslavia and the world's 4th military power tilt towards Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to mark the biggest war and bloodshed in Europe after World War II. Bosnians, under the leadership of this person, decide to resist this army. Alija Izetbegovic, who the Americans know as a secret Ayatollah, is the person who founded the Democratic Action Party, the most powerful supporter of Muslim rights in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The longest siege of the capital of a country in the history of classical wars of the world. 1,425 days of siege that killed at least 11,541 people. More than 70% of Muslim lands are occupied. The Muslims, who have neither such an army nor weapons and equipment in the war, have fallen into the trap of the Great Army of Yugoslavia. Finally, in 1995, Srebrenica, one of the eastern cities of Bosnia and Herzegovina, was declared a safe zone by the United Nations to protect civilians, but the region is soon invaded by the Yugoslav army. The extremist Serbian armed forces first besieged the city and then heavily bombarded the city with cannons and rockets for 5 straight days. The Bosnian Muslim people are massacred. With the fall of Srebrenica and the distrust in the UN peacekeeping forces, more than 15,000 people fled the city on foot through the forest and mountains to the city of Tuzla. None of the residents of the city know that the road they are walking down will lead them to their deaths and will never take them to liberty. The war tragedies in Bosnia have not been forgotten, and in 1999, Kosovo, one of the autonomous regions of the former Yugoslavia, was attacked by Serbs. The independence of Kosovo, which is economically very important for Greater Serbia, can deal a major blow to the Serbs. Sporadic conflicts begin. The security forces and Yugoslav army sided with the Serbs. As tensions and violence spiral out of control, NATO, which has been silent on the massacre of Bosnian Muslims until that moment, finally steps in. It was not in the interest of NATO to enter the war that it started against the Bosnian Muslims. Croatia, which was NATO's intelligence base in the region, had to be protected. With the Croats entering the war with Bosnia, NATO has no choice but to remain silent. But now the situation is different. Mediation efforts is NATO's only solution to end the war. But every time one of the two parties to the conflict violates the terms of the ceasefire. On April 12, 1999, NATO convenes a meeting and declares that Milosevic, the dictator president of the Serbs, must withdraw all his forces from Kosovo. But Serbia refused to back down in the face of force. Europe and the US take the case to the UN Security Council. Russia vetoes the resolution. NATO has no choice but to start a conflict. NATO decides to bomb the Serbian military infrastructure to get its army out of Kosovo. If the Serbs resist, NATO can attack the economic and cultural infrastructure in Kosovo. The U.S. president these days is this man, Bill Clinton, someone who is going to renege on all promises made by Bush to Gorbachev.
Our mission is clear: to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's purpose so that the Serbian leaders understand the imperative of reversing course, to deter an even bloodier offensive against innocent civilians in Kosovo, and if necessary, to seriously damage the Serbian military's capacity to harm the people of Kosovo. In short, if President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
Nothing had changed in Kosovo yet when at 1900, on the 24th day of March 1999, the first bomb went off in Yugoslavia. NATO has taken action against the Serbs. Thousands of fighters from NATO bases in Italy, Germany, and U.S. aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt are preparing for this war. A heavy war breaks out. Milosevic's government announced damage caused by the NATO attack on the country amounted to over $80 billion. 1,000 dead and 6,000 wounded. The figures of the casualties raised the alarm. Serbia, a small country with a weak economy, must stand up against 11 powerful countries in the world. The destruction of 34 bridges, 57% of Serbia's oil reserves, and all of Yugoslavian oil refineries will further reduce Serbia's power to resist. The United States bears the brunt of the campaign, providing the bulk of the warplanes and conducting 30-hour missions from its base in Missouri. During the 78 days of the operation, more than 300 cruise missiles are fired. NATO is now dropping bombs on the Bosnian people who are close to victory. NATO intends to get involved in the wars in the eastern regions more seriously, and these NATO attacks are just beginning. When the reform policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, failed to solve the economic problems of the people of the countries under his influence, rumors of secession and independence were spread from all corners of the region. The Communist Party of the defeated Soviet Party no longer had power against the will of the people. The Soviet Union collapsed. There was no mention of the Warsaw Military Security Pact or the powerful Soviet Army any longer. Gorbachev's military forces left Eastern Europe. And now the rest of the story. It is November 1989. Meanwhile, the people of East Germany have been protesting against their economic problems for weeks when a government spokesperson makes a strange mistake in a press interview.
Die Passfrage kann ich jetzt nicht beantworten. Das ist auch eine technische Frage. Ich weiß ja nicht, die Testpässe müssen ja, also damit jeder im Besitz eines Passes überhaupt erstmal ausgegeben werden. Wir wollten aber sicherlich inhaltlich aus.
In an interview, Günter Schabowski, spokesman of the East German government, announced citizens can now visit West Germany without any restrictions.
Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich.
Not long after his interview, the soldiers faced a sudden gathering of a large group of people next to the Great Berlin Wall. The Great Berlin Wall was built 20 years earlier by then Soviet Communist leader Nikita Khrushchev to separate East and West Germany. The concrete wall, 43 kilometers from Berlin, had a death strip of 146 meters width where hundreds of watchtowers and watchdogs were stationed around the clock to prevent German migration to the other side. On November 9th, with the announcement of the member of the government to the press, this chapter of history ended forever. The Berlin Wall collapses at once amid a popular outburst, and it translates into the reunification of East and West Germany, an alliance that will lead to bitter events a few months later. When the news of the unification of Germany spreads throughout Europe, a major plan on the agenda for the French president remains inconclusive. François Mitterrand seeks to strengthen European solidarity. Mitterrand became famous for his escape from a German POW camp during World War II and now plans to shape the future of Europe with his European Confederation plan. Mitterrand believes that all European countries, including the Eastern Bloc, should become united and form a common structure for cooperation, security, and peace in order to reduce their military, political dependence on the US and NATO. When the news of German unification reached Mitterrand's office in France, he suddenly got disappointed. He believes now East Germany should also wait for the invasion of their territory by NATO. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has now become the foremost power in the region. Mitterrand, who still has high hopes for the implementation of his plan, has no idea that this person is making plans to achieve a global idea he has in mind. George Bush, President of the United States.
Our European allies are sovereign nations, and the decision on how they are governed rests with their citizens and with their elected representatives. However, the position of the United States on the subject of communist participation in the governments of our allies is well known.
At the end of his presidency, Mitterrand, who was not in a good health condition, announced in his speech that the European Confederation plan did not come to fruition due to a lack of sufficient support and rapid changes in the world. And now the world is involved in a new development in West Asia, in which the footprints of NATO can clearly be noticed. August 2nd, 1990, Kuwait. This tiny country in West Asia is Kuwait. It is linked to Iraq and Saudi Arabia via land and has a maritime border with Iran. The history of this country goes back to the time of the Al-Hamid dynasty. The Al-Hamid clan, who used to store their supplies and weapons in a fort called Kut and built a city from that area called Kuwait, and after a few years of ruling, they gave the kingdom to the Al-Sabah dynasty. Kuwait is now an important country in West Asia, of course mostly due to its oil field, the Burgan. Burgan, which is located in the southwest of Kuwait, is known as the second largest land field in the world. The field supplies a large part of the oil production in the country. For years, everything was according to the wishes of the Arabs of Kuwait until the dawn of August 2nd, 1990, when the people of the city woke up to an ear-splitting sound. The sound made headlines in Arabic newspapers the next morning. Saddam Hussein had attacked Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, who likes to follow in the footsteps of the former leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin, justified his attack, arguing that Kuwait is an artificial country that was built by Western colonialists from the shores of Iraq.
The fact is that before August the 2nd, Kuwait was an independent country and a member of the United Nations.
أيضا تشكل خلفية قانونية وتاريخية مقابلة.
Which also constitute legal and historical background which may stand opposite to this argument.
أيضا نحن لو نسأل
If we ask international public opinion in general, was it legal for this part of Iraq to have been severed from Iraq in 1913? Was it in accordance with the law?
The Kuwaitis, who had received a warning just a few hours before the invasion thanks to a new surveillance radar attached to a balloon, helped Al-Sabah ruler and some ranking officials in the Kuwaiti army to flee. At dawn, the day of the invasion, only the civilians of Kuwait were there to be targeted by Saddam's deadly missiles. In less than 14 hours, Kuwait in its entirety fell to the hands of the Iraqis. The speed and efficiency of the operation shocked U.S. officials who were watching the events through their intelligence satellites. At 11:11 a.m. the day after the attack, Radio Kuwait went silent after broadcasting these words, "Arabs, brothers, dear brothers, Muslims rushed to our rescue.
لكل رؤساء الدول العربية والأعضاء في الجامعة نداء من الكويت بالتدخل السريع فالاتصالات مقطوعة بيننا وبين العالم كله.
Sheikh Jaber, his cabinet, and senior members of the Sabah family fled to Saudi Arabia to establish a government in exile. About 350,000 Kuwaiti refugees sought refuge in Saudi Arabia from the south. Within 1 day of Kuwait's occupation, U.S. President Bush condemned the attack and demanded unconditional withdrawal of the Iraqi army from Kuwaiti territory.
I wanted you to know that, first off, we view this situation with gravity. We view it as a matter of grave concern to this country and internationally as well.
On August 5th, the United Nations issued its vote to impose economic sanctions against Iraq. A few days later, the UN Security Council also authorized the use of force to implement the decision.
If Iraq does not reverse its course peacefully, then other necessary measures, including the use of force, should be authorized.
The U.S. on its own carried the burden of providing security for other Persian Gulf countries. The Arab countries were now looking for reliable support, such as the U.S., amid the insecurity caused by Saddam's invasion, asked NATO for help. Saudi Arabia is the first Arab country to take the lead. On August 6, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who is more famous for gambling, met with the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. Fahd intends to fix Saudi Arabia's international relations. During the meeting, Fahd, who is worried about Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, agrees to a massive deployment of American military forces in his kingdom. After the meeting, Bush issued an order on implementing an operational plan 1002. The plan, specifically designed to defend Saudi Arabia against Iraqi aggression, includes deploying hundreds of thousands of American troops in the region and equipping Saudi Arabia with advanced weapons. 1002 set the stage for an extensive and permanent American military presence in the Persian Gulf. Now, other regions of the Persian Gulf felt the void for an organization like NATO. From now on, NATO is on standby to receive a new order from the White House. On the morning of the day when King Fahd met with Cheney, Saddam Hussein came up with an idea. For him, the meeting was a last straw. He had put his relations with the U.S. at risk. Why did the U.S. act against Saddam? The Iraqi government was baffled.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
Saddam drove his car towards the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad. He promises Joseph Wilson not to attack Saudi Arabia in the hope that his relations with the U.S. will be restored to normal. During his meeting with the U.S. envoy, he did his best to make him understand that a strong Iraq can become the main ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. But behind all these meetings, no one knows what gave Saddam the confidence that despite all the sanctions the U.S. imposed on him in the Security Council, he could now talk so easily about the normalization of relations with the White House. It remained a mystery until some speculations were raised. The speculations say that Saddam launched the attack on Kuwait after a green light from Washington. Amid all that speculation, however, the claim by Scott Ritter, the former U.S. ambassador in Moscow, was noteworthy. Ritter later says the U.S. assured Iraq that if it attacked Kuwait, it would not face any serious military response.
Well, we hope to gain access to a number of locations in Iraq that I was very familiar with as a weapons inspector. There's been a lot of what I call irresponsible speculation about what Iraq is doing today now that weapons inspectors aren't in Iraq. And I think by visiting sites, by talking with Iraqi government officials, we can put together a documentary that shows the reality of the situation in Iraq today.
These speculations among political circles were rife until a few days later, everything suddenly faded with Bush's decision. What did the U.S. president have in mind? No one had a definite answer. Despite the agreements that Saddam made with Wilson not to attack Saudi Arabia, and despite his promises, on August 8th of the same year, U.S. military forces entered Saudi Arabia after receiving official permission from Bush.
At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
A brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division and a number of American F-15 fighter jets, along with several American naval ships and the Independence and Eisenhower aircraft carriers, was nothing that would make Saddam regret what he did. He felt that a major war would break out. The UN intensified its commercial and financial sanctions. Britain and France rushed to help the U.S. and each sent a brigade to the region.
Withdraw from Kuwait or face a coalition ready and willing to employ all means necessary.
Saddam was terrified. He was desperate. He had to protect his reputation. Can an attack on Saudi Arabia be a proper answer for Baghdad? Saudi Arabia is the world's largest producer and exporter of oil. The Iraqi government had to investigate further. On August 12th, 12 of the 21 Arab League countries passed a resolution condemning Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. They also announced their readiness to provide military support to Saudi Arabia. August 28th, Saddam, who had been trying to establish a temporary government in Kuwait, announced that this region was now the 19th province of Iraq. The names of the places suddenly became Iraqi, and the Basra province in southern Iraq expanded towards Kuwait. There was no security in Kuwait anymore. The Iraqi forces who were relieved from occupying Kuwait were looting, raping, torturing, murdering, and stealing Kuwait's economic assets. Although the occupying government of Iraq set the death penalty for looters, it strangely ignored the transfer of medical equipment from hospitals, assets of the Kuwait Scientific Research Institute, Islamic art treasures from the Kuwait National Museum, and over $1.6 billion in gold and cash to Baghdad. On September 22nd, Baghdad warns that it will attack Saudi Arabia and Israel if it is crippled by sanctions. It says the attack will be the mother of all attacks. 3 days later, Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze announced in his speech at the UN General Assembly that Moscow will support military action against Iraq with the authorization of the United Nations. On the same day, the UN Security Council voted to expand sanctions against Iraq to include aircraft. And it means the possibility of confrontation in the regional airspace. On October the 10th, U.S. officials are seriously following the discussion about military attack. Combat commanders put their plans for the attack on the desks of top U.S. military leaders at the Pentagon. They have a fundamental problem, though. After the war with Iran, with the support of Western countries, the Iraqi army has become the 5th largest army in the world. On November 29, 1990, the UN Security Council, with 12 votes in favor and 2 against, authorizes its members to use any means necessary in cooperation with Kuwait to force Iraq to withdraw unconditionally. The resolution also sets a specific deadline. Iraq must withdraw by January 15, 1991.
We must put the choice to Saddam Hussein in unmistakable terms.
Although Saddam Hussein is afraid of the developments, he is not under any pressure to retreat. In late October, Bush finally makes a decision and announces it to the American people a week later. He decides to launch a military invasion against Iraq.
To the contrary, what we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
The U.S., which has become the world's sole power after the removal of the Soviet Union, seems to close all the doors of negotiations on this decision. It only pursues one objective: Saddam Hussein must be completely removed from Kuwait. But how does Iraq's presence in Kuwait hurt the U.S.? The story goes back to May 1990, when Baghdad held a meeting with Arab leaders. 1990 was a difficult year for the Iraqi people. The Iraqi government, which had just emerged from a war with Iran, had not yet been able to settle its huge debts. Saddam had a new idea. He decided to urge Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to call off $30 billion of Iraq's foreign debt. But when he failed to achieve his goal through this approach, everyone's attention was focused on oil prices, of which Saddam Hussein claimed that Kuwait was reducing. In the international market, the lower the sales of oil, the higher its price. Iraq had counted on the surge in oil prices to pay its debts, but Kuwait refused to walk down the path that Iraq wanted. Kuwait did not reduce oil sales in the region. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia needed Western aid, so the increase in oil prices would endanger their international relations, especially with the Americans. In politics, Saddam would unrelentingly stand his ground. The only thing he needed was to get someone suspicious of someone, then he would not wait for a reason and would immediately plan an attack. This policy worried Iraq's neighboring countries on that day. July 17th, Saddam Hussein appeared on a TV program. He intended to reveal his differences with Kuwait in the program. It all started with a verbal attack on the United Arab Emirates. The reason for this attack was exceeding the oil export quota that OPEC had set for them. A day after that TV program, Kuwait was accused of stealing oil from the Al Ramila oil field on the border between Iraq and Kuwait. Criticisms about the accusation were made. On August 1st, the negotiations between the two countries were stopped in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Hours later, some news broke out that Iraq's armored forces invaded Kuwait. In the fight over oil, Bush was convinced he had to punish Saddam, who was blocking the oil sales. Therefore, the attack on Iraq would be launched by a U.S.-led coalition.
Should military action be required, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be a protracted, drawn-out war.
January 17th, 1991, Baghdad.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
Before dawn, the people of Baghdad wake up to the sounds of U.S. airstrikes. The coalition forces, supported by NATO, started extensive airstrikes against Iraqi targets. The airstrikes were dubbed Operation Desert Storm. A few days later, the ground forces reached Iraq. The pressure on Saddam's government was increasing. Now, While sitting at his desk in the White House, Bush had a new idea. Four weeks after the start of Operation Desert Storm, Bush addressed the Iraqi people in his speech. Words that cost Saddam dearly.
I'm here today to explain to the people of Iraq why the United States and the world community has responded the way it has to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. My purpose is not to trade accusations, not to escalate the war of words, but to speak with candor.
In this speech, Bush encouraged the Iraqi army and people to act and force Saddam Hussein to step down. Bush's message was gradually being relayed to Iraq through all international television and radio channels.
A little bit that the first wave of F-15 took off.
He also sounded a bit upset that he was not informed. He is not seen to be.
Fighter bombers has taken off.
The coalition planes were all being mobilized for a new mission against the Iraqi government. They're assigned to drop leaflets asking Iraqi soldiers and civilians to fill the streets and alleys and overthrow Saddam Hussein and his aides. The coalition forces were pursuing a new plan to ensure that George Bush's message was communicated to all the villages. They took over a Ba'athist radio station in Iraq previously funded by the CIA and beat the drums of war with messages in Arabic.
It is my hope that somehow the Iraqi people can, even now, convince their dictator that he must lay down his arms.
Another message had been sent to all parts of Iraq. Kurdish popular forces in the north and Shias to the south, who had been secretly planning to overthrow Saddam for years, get involved. This is a chance they've been waiting for. Saddam, who is taken aback, walks down the presidential palace in his usual military uniform to find a solution, but he hears some news. News that was going to shake the pillars of his party in Baghdad. On February 27th, it was announced that Kuwait was occupied by Iraqi forces. U.S. forces continued the operation and attacked the Iraqis 120 miles west of Kuwait. They staged an attack from behind on Iraq's armored reserves, so suddenly part of Iraq's military power falls into the U.S. hands. The next day, Saddam loses his grip on the situation. He never thought that his attack on Kuwait would have such serious consequences for him. When Bush announces a ceasefire at 8 a.m. on February 28th, 100 hours after the start of the ground operation, Iraq just collapsed in a civil war.
From the moment Operation Desert Storm commenced on January 16th until the time the guns fell silent at midnight 1 week ago, this nation has watched its sons and daughters with pride, watched over them with prayer. As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
As a result of the US and its allies' attack on Saddam's army, a power vacuum was created in Iraq, and the Shabaniya uprising in March 1991 was formed. The Iraqi people rose up against Saddam's authoritarian rule, an uprising that started following the Kuwait War. On March 1, 1991, Iraqi military personnel who had returned from the Kuwait War fired a tank shell at Saddam Hussein's portrait at the Saad Square in Basra. The news spreads very quickly. People attack the Ba'ath Party headquarters and the local prison and capture the city. When Basra falls, other cities of Iraq, even in Kurdish regions, join the uprising. Little by little, other cities, except for those in central provinces, fall into the hands of the protesters. The religious authority in Najaf now stepped in and took over the administration of the country's affairs by establishing a council in Iraq. The call by the council reaches the central and southern provinces, which were mainly Shia populated. The Shia forces that took over the power from Basra moved towards Najaf, Karbala, and Nasiriyah and targeted the government security forces and the regime's positions. And now the news of the Iraqi Shia uprising against Saddam Hussein reaches everywhere, even Iran. Thousands of Iraqi resistance forces who are in exile in Iran, along with the Badr brigades under the command of Qasim Soleimani, Abu Mati al-Muhandis, and Hadi al-Amiri, crossed the border and entered Iraq. The Iraqi government completely lost control over the situation. 14 of the 18 Iraqi provinces revolted against the government. Saddam's army had no control over them. The resistance forces, which were mainly Shias, were now armed with weapons they obtained from the police station and warehouses. Saddam's years-old dream was about to come true, but there was still a fundamental problem facing the people. When the Iraqi Shia uprising upset Saddam, he immediately ordered attack helicopters to be prepared to crack down on the uprising. It doesn't take long for Saddam's regime to take a measure against the uprising by using long-range artillery and armored ground forces in addition to helicopters. "30,000 to 60,000 Shias in the south and about 20,000 Kurds in the north were massacred by Saddam Hussein's army. The Iraqi government used chemical weapons, phosphorus bombs, and even Scud missiles to suppress the uprising. The resistance forces must find a solution to the problem. For them, the only way to resist attacks was to create a no-fly zone. They needed international help to declare the region as a no-fly zone. The US could spread the news to everyone. Now, George Bush must step in and act against Saddam and in favor of the Shia resistance forces. In fact, he himself had set the stage in this field. As time passed, hopes for international aid faded away. According to the news, on the other side of the pond inside the White House, behind closed doors and on the desk of President George Bush, some papers of political comments were being exchanged. The US has made a new decision. It has no intention of opening up the space for the emergence of an Islamic government in Iraq, because that would increase Iran's influence in the country. So the US makes a final decision. Although until that day, it intended to punish Saddam by showing its power, but now the story was changing. It was now about the hidden power of Islam in the region. If they came to power, they would turn the tables on NATO in the Persian Gulf. The US now has to put aside all of its worries about West Asia's oil and Saddam's actions and focus on the Shia resistance. So he turns down the request for help from the resistance in the region, even though until that day, everyone knew about NATO's military power in the Persian Gulf.
Not discussing intervention, I would not discuss any military options, even if we'd agreed upon them.
Empowering the crippled arm of Saddam's army was now on the U.S. agenda at the request of Bush. The UN Security Council Resolution 670 to ban the flight was ignored as Saddam Hussein's helicopters flew to suppress the insurgents. With this move, not only the Iraqi airspace will not be safe, but also a part of the Iraqi weapons that the U.S. seized from the Iraqi army just a few weeks back were handed over by Bush to Saddam's regime. Civilians and insurgents were slowly fleeing the city. They were, however, unaware that on the roads leading out, the helicopter crews of the Iraqi army were waiting for them. They poured kerosene on the people and set them ablaze while American planes circled overhead and just watched. With Saddam's attacks on the Shia insurgents, history was marking its most brutal chapters of war crimes. Early April 1991, Saddam's regime easily crushed both Shia and Kurdish resistance. On April 13th, Bush revealed his dual actions in his speech. He was now talking about an idea he had been planning for years. The idea was called the New World Order.
A new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
Although the idea was still not well defined, it was the backbone of the U.S. justifications for opposing the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq and then the attack on Iraq to some extent.
I have to go to work. I gotta go to work.
U.S. officials who were previously trying to define the concept in the shape of new global cooperation and the dependence of all of the countries in the world on each other was apparently now trying to hide an idea from everyone. The idea would lead to the U.S. leadership of the world. NATO was one of the U.S.'s first ideas to establish its global leadership. After Iraq's attack on Kuwait, the organization managed to gain a foothold in the Persian Gulf region and make European and Arab countries more dependent on its forces. Now, after the suppression of the Shabaniya Intifada, Saddam is more confident about U.S. support. The financial aid from the White House flows to Saddam's government. With this aid, Saddam's regime was reinvigorated and continued to remain in power, but the story of NATO in the Persian Gulf does not end with Iraq.